Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this morning's Open Caucus, focusing on barriers to interprovincial trade. It's unusual not to have Senator Eggleton here this morning. Senator Eggleton is a senator who started Open Caucuses a couple of years ago. He's since retired, and I hope he enjoys his retirement, but we do miss him very much. I'm Senator Jane Cordy. I'm a senator from Nova Scotia, and beside me is today's co-chair, Senator Diane Bellemare, who is a senator from Quebec. The Open Caucus is a forum for discussion on issues of national importance. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Independent Senators Group, also known as the ISG, the Independent Senate Liberals, and the government representative in the Senate. This non-partisan discussion is open to all parliamentarians. The invitations went out to all senators, to members of the House of Commons and the Senate. It's open to staff, it's open to media, and as you know, it's open to the public. Canada's framework for interprovincial trade is patchy at best. While Canada has signed onto free trade agreements with countries around the world, there are significant barriers to the free flow of goods and services within our own borders of Canada. Studies have suggested that these constraints cost the Canadian economy up to $130 billion every year and may negatively impact international trade relations. While federal, provincial, and territorial governments signed onto the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, CFTA, in April of 2017 with the aim of mitigating interprovincial barriers, almost half of the agreements, 345 pages, are filled with exceptions to the agreement and opt-out measures. Today, we ask questions. How have interprovincial trade barriers improved since CFTA was signed? What measures should be taken to further eliminate barriers to trade, investment, and labor mobility? There's coffee available at the back of the room, coffee and tea for anybody who would like it. Translation is available. There are earpieces on the chairs that you're sitting at or around the table. Channel 1 is for English and Channel 2 is for French. We encourage audience participation. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, please let the Open Caucus coordinator, Sarah Paulwin, know, or Susanna Doherty, who is my staff member. Susanna, would you? Yeah. So just let them know, and they'll bring your name to us at the table. I'd like to ask my co-chair, Senator Bellemare, now to say a few words.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to co-chair today this session of the Open Caucus of the Independent Liberal Senators, started a few years ago. And this is the first time that I co-chair this panel on a very important topic, namely removing the barriers to interprovincial trade in Canada. And so we know that this exists since Confederation, and one of the basic purposes of the Confederation was to have a Confederation-wide free trade territory. So I'll be giving the floor to Ms. Polly, who will introduce our presenter.
Being here today, but I will introduce our first speaker, the Honourable Perrin Beatty. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the 200,000-member Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canada's largest and most representative national business association. Prior to joining the Canadian Chamber in August of 2007, Perrin was the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. He is a former politician. During his 21 years in Parliament, he served as Minister in 7 different portfolios, including Treasury Board, National Revenue, Solicitor General, Defence, National Health and Welfare, Communications, and External Affairs. We're very pleased to have you here this morning. You can begin, Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your gracious introduction. All of those cabinet portfolios simply prove that if you don't have any discernible skills, you can not hold any one job for very long. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's an important initiative that you've taken on a subject which is of key importance to Canadians. Interestingly, of all of the topics that I find myself speaking on over the course of a year as President of the Canadian Chamber, none generates greater reaction from Canadians at large than the issue of interprovincial barriers to trade. It's an issue that's much more than economic for Canadians. It goes to the heart of who we are as Canadians and how we see ourselves as a nation. And for the vast majority of Canadians, it's simply incomprehensible that today we have barriers in place in Canada that would be illegal between countries in Europe. And there's a feeling that there's unfinished business from Confederation over 150 years after the country was formed, that we need to complete the job and to be truly one country. It's, as you were pointing out, Madam Chair, particularly important to take stock of Canada's internal trade barriers nearly a year and a half after the Canadian Free Trade Agreement was announced. And let me just mention an irony. I just came from 2 days at the North American Forum, where we were talking much of the time, it won't surprise you, about the USMCA, the successor agreement to NAFTA. It's extraordinary to me that we can have free trade agreements with other countries but not have free trade within Canada. If anybody had ever told me that when I was in government at the time that we signed the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, I never would have believed it was possible. But the other thing that just as a Canadian seems bizarre to me is that we have our provinces and territories treating with each other in the same way as sovereign countries treat with each other to develop trade agreements. This isn't something built into the Constitution. It is in the Constitution, although Ottawa has not exercised the full authority that it has under it. But the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is, in fact, in essence, a treaty among our provinces and territories. And it's a curious commentary, I think, on the state of Confederation that we have to handle it this way. I want to start really by recognizing and saluting the contributions of the Senate to the debate on this issue. The 2016 Tear Down These Walls study that was done by the Senate was landmark, and it's essential reading for anyone who, when it comes to understanding the impacts of internal trade barriers in our economy. While the Chamber has long advocated the removal of interprovincial trade barriers, now more than ever, it's vital for us to get Canada's house in order in light of the global trading and competitiveness challenges facing our economy. Now, we're not alone in saying this. Our federal and provincial governments have said much of the same thing. But despite this consensus, the Federation has surprisingly little progress to show for it. When the Canadian Free Trade Agreement was reached in April 2017, the Chamber's reaction was one of cautious optimism. We were optimistic because the old agreement on internal trade was a woefully insufficient vehicle to advance the interests of a 21st century economy, and Canadian companies were desperate for a new approach, and the signal being given by governments was that they believed that we should be one country and one market. We were cautious, though, because despite the goodwill behind the CFTA, it was likely to bump up against the same challenges that the AIT faced, and that's what we've seen. More specifically, we said that the success of the deal depends upon the new regulatory conciliation and cooperation table, the federal, provincial, territorial body that was set up to advance regulatory alignment. The success of the CFTA depends on this body because most of the trade barriers are regulatory differences, divergent sets of rules and processes between provinces and territories that's created a tyranny of small differences for business. Unlike international trade agreements, liberalization in Canada is not dependent on removing tariffs. It depends instead on the province's ability to harmonize regulations and compliance processes. Now, to date, progress under the RCT has been slow. Even if we give it the benefit of the doubt to governments that it takes time to set a new body like this up, to establish work plans and to negotiate regulatory alignment, we're concerned that the RCT may not advance this work with the urgency that it needs. I say this for a few reasons based on how the RCT has been established. First, according to the CFTA, governments may opt out of regulatory alignment if they determine that reconciliation is not desirable for their jurisdiction. Second, there's nothing in the agreement that prevents the development of differing rules in future areas of regulation. Governments can use the RCT to develop common regulations, but they're not required to do so, and they can opt out of joint development at any time. Third, industry has no seat on RCT. Despite being directly impacted by this work, business does not have a formal role with the RCT, and the only built-in accountability to industry is that the RCT will publish an annual report on its work. Now, while the Chamber believes in the goodwill of governments to use the new agreement to reduce barriers, these loopholes in the RCT make it highly susceptible to the paralysis that plagued the AIT, slow, incremental change that doesn't meet the needs of the Canadian economy. If governments believe that internal trade barriers are a serious economic problem, why don't they negotiate more binding processes into the CFTA and fewer off-ramps? At the very least, while opting out of eliminating a barrier, there should be a higher threshold for governments to justify those decisions beyond an internal determination that alignment is not desirable for their jurisdiction. Now, perhaps the biggest sign that CFTA still needs a shot in the arm is the Prime Minister's announcement that he'll host a First Ministers' meeting on internal trade this fall. This meeting provides an opportunity for First Ministers to give the CFTA the jolt it needs. It's a good agreement, but it requires strong, sustained political leadership to achieve its potential. And if I can just add parenthetically, there was a lovely story that the late Jim Flaherty used to tell about when he was minister in Ontario and was responsible for interprovincial trade. And he said once a year the ministers would get together and they would receive reports from their officials about all of the barriers that had been put in place and how each of the provinces had sinned. And he said, and then we would go to dinner. Nothing changed year to year, and little has changed since then. One suggestion that we have for First Ministers is to accelerate regulatory alignment through mutual recognition. Under mutual recognition, a good or service legally provided in one province should be allowed into another, even if regulatory requirements differ. Mutual recognition is the basis of how the EU and Australia govern their internal markets. After establishing mutual recognition, provinces and territories can build on this principle and continue the long march toward harmonization standards and regulations. There's no reason premiers couldn't kickstart a serious effort to establish mutual recognition of regulatory standards for more areas of our economy. But whatever the outcome of the First Ministers' meeting, our political leaders must remain front and center to put pressure on each other and their respective bureaucracies to accelerate the removal of barriers. Now, consider what transpired in the NAFTA negotiations. The federal government, in close consultation with industry and other stakeholders, engaged in months and months of high-profile, difficult negotiations to achieve a new North American Free Trade Pact. Why can't our provincial and federal governments tackle the elimination of internal barriers with the same urgency? Studies show that Canada's internal trade barriers cost the Canadian economy between $50 and $130 billion annually. Negotiations should be happening around the clock to unlock this economic activity. There's much to like about the CFTA compared to the old agreement on internal trade, including the move to a negative list approach. But the CFTA is not the same as an internal trade deal. It's not the end state. It's a promise to do more to liberalize trade in this country. That promise cannot be fulfilled if implementation is left to regulators in the absence of political leadership. In summary, the CFTA is full of potential, but so is the old agreement on internal trade. The Chamber is calling on our federal and provincial governments to take decisive action to meet that potential so that we can make it easier for businesses to create jobs, to grow our economy to the benefit of Canadian families from one coast to another. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bettier.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Beatty. What a good start you gave to our meeting. Let's move to Madame Moreau and Madame Poman. Monique Moreau, who is Vice Chair, National Affairs at the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, which represent more than 109,000 members across the country. And this federation is based in Ottawa, and Monique is in charge of the development and coordination of activities regarding the legislative and policies issues. And Corinne Coleman, who is vice chairman of STA, and she works in Ottawa, where she manages the national issues, and she also has the economic aspect of partnership and the legislative team of the Atlantic Canada of CFIB. Thank you.
Opportunity to be here today to share the CFIB's perspective on internal trade. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the slides that we have available to you now. I won't spend too much time since we had a introduction already by Senator Benmar, but as she mentioned, we're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization. We actually represent 110,000 business owner members across Canada who collectively employ over 1.25 million Canadians and account for 75 billion, or nearly half of Canada's GDP. Our members represent all sectors of the economy and are found in every region of the country. Collectively, Canada's small and medium-sized business enterprises employ 70% of Canadians working in the private sector and are responsible for the bulk of new job creation. Addressing issues of importance to them, such as internal trade and the barriers that come with it, can have widespread impact on job creation and the economy. As you may be aware, we take our direction solely from our membership through a variety of surveys through the year. So today's data will come from a survey dated from 2014, which feels a bit old, but we have every reason to believe that this data is most likely still quite accurate. There we go. So before we begin, we talked a bit about what are trade barriers. We have to think back to the academic approach that many studies have taken on this, between prohibitive barriers, technical barriers, regulatory barriers, but what that really means to Canadian small business owners is red tape. The concept of barriers to trade within Canada to them may seem ridiculous. After all, there are no guards at our provincial or territorial borders, there are no tariffs on goods or services when they pass between one province to another. And while these barriers are what we might normally expect as trade restrictions, the reality is that red tape, whether it be navigating a maze of different or conflicting rules in each jurisdiction, completing paperwork for different governments, jumping through hoops to ensure compliance with a number of different bureaucracies, all too often limits the opportunities of Canadian firms to do business across the country. And frankly, this serves as a drag on our productivity and economic growth potential. So we define a trade barrier as any regulation or obligation created by any level of government that creates an impediment or an additional cost when trading with another province or territory. As I mentioned, these three trade barriers can be either prohibitive, technical, or regulatory. We talked already a bit about the AIT and some of the history behind it, but on slide 4, I wanted to spend a bit of time on the priorities that our business owner members feel are important, and that is, should we be reducing trade barriers across provincial and territorial boundaries? And you will see that 87% of our members overwhelmingly voted yes. It's a fairly straightforward question. But it's important because, as Mr. Beattie said, we've been dealing with this issue for decades now. And when it was ratified in '94, the Canadian Agreement on Internal Trade was heralded as a significant step forward for trade within Canada. But the signing around, many years later, of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, known as CETA, as we know, with Europe, and other international trade agreements since then, have highlighted how, at the time, the AIT had not kept pace. This comparison to an international trade agreement is important, and I'll tell you why in a few more slides. When we surveyed our membership about whether or not they trade, we thought it was important to find out whether there were any provincial differences. And the reality is that the Canadian small businesses do trade, and they trade not just with their neighbours, as we might have suspected due to some of the regional trade agreements that came up in western provinces and eastern provinces, but they really do send their goods across the country when they need to. So you will have someone in BC sending their goods to Quebec. So while the print is quite small, you do see that the red lines are those members of ours who have sold products, and the blue have purchased from other provinces. So in this survey, as you can see on slide 5, for the most part, businesses are more likely to trade with businesses when they're within their own and neighboring regions, but of course they do send products across the country. So what are some of the challenges when trading internally? As I mentioned, it really comes back to red tape. As you'll see, 34% of our members found that taxation rules were too complicated. The same said that it was too expensive, and another near third almost has said that it was due to regulations. Only a third said there were no challenges, and the rest of our membership identified paperwork as being too burdensome, lack of information, lack of contact, and in some instances a lack of transportation, which is important. Nearly 1 in 10 small businesses identified an issue with this. We know that the expenses associated with trade, whether it be shipping costs or paying for different permits and licenses, can be a significant challenge. So now we get to the principles of what an internal trade agreement should contain. If you look on slide 7, the most important principle for internal trade from the perspective of a small business is that it should be as easy to trade within Canada as it is with another country. And this is why I was referring to the CETA and now the USMCA. There is great interest in making sure that all businesses have access to open markets within Canada, and that the federal government should not just play a role, but consider leading efforts to facilitate the enhancement of internal trade. 3/4 of small businesses also believe that there should be appropriate consequences for government that create barriers, and that's something that we think is missing from the current Canadian Free Trade Agreement. There needs to be a motivation and political will in order to move this forward with the urgency that it requires. I've highlighted for senators here some examples from our membership about the kind of trade barriers that they're facing. To give you a sense of how these barriers affect small businesses in Canada, I wanted to illustrate some of these. So slides 8 through 10 illustrate some of these challenges. The first is on transportation issues. A transportation company in Ontario highlights that they have to be mindful of different permit regulations in different provinces and at different times of year. This is a mind-boggling trade barrier for this kind of country, where we know that there are challenges changing from summer and winter tires. Canadians face that in most areas of the country, but it really does slow down trade. Again, in Ontario, when it comes to the food that we eat, different tax structures, the high cost of transportation, and restrictions on certain food products have led one business owner member of ours to purchase American and European imports over Canadian products. And we suspect this is only going to increase with the new trade deals that have been struck. Lastly, I wanted to highlight a commercial diving outfit in New Brunswick who are required to register for and administer workers' compensation in each province that they work in, plus be registered with construction safety associations in each province. Surely registration and good standing in one provincial jurisdiction should be sufficient. We often refer to an anecdote that our vice president of the Atlantic region came up with, which is that gravity is the same across the country. Surely the safety measures that you need to take to prevent construction workers from falling should be the same across provinces. I don't think it changes whether you're in Saskatchewan or in BC. So despite these criticisms, we were very pleased when the Canadian Free Trade Agreement was signed. We highlighted it with something unique to CFIB, our Golden Scissors Award, and here you see us awarding an actual award of Golden Scissors to all premiers when it was signed, as well as Federal Minister Navdeep Bains. It was a year of lobbying in the making, and so we did want to highlight the work that they had gone through to cut through the red tape. But now the real work begins, and as we discussed already, this falls to the reconciliation table. So we've highlighted 6 different areas that we think are critical for the RCT to consider before they get to the end of their mandate of their list of 23, scheduled for July 2019. We do think that's already a bit long, but if we're trying to get to a nuts and bolts or low-hanging fruit areas where we can ask business owners or premiers to help business owners, it's to harmonize regulations for wide load transportation. So we're pleased to see that on the list. We would have liked to see more details on a common corporate registry. Again, every Canadian business gets a CRA business number. This should be sufficient to get them to business registration across provinces. They are taking steps towards that, but it is a really critical piece for business owners because that's how they start, and we need to harmonize that to make it easier for them. We'd like to recognize certain trade and professional certifications from other provinces. Again, this should be a no-brainer. It's not complicated. Encourage the trade associations to do it. Mutually recognized food inspection. We had a member from the Northwest Territories tell us about how they couldn't import sushi from BC, even though there was a demand from it there, because in BC the sushi was only provincially regulated and not federally regulated, and so it couldn't go across the border. I mean, they're mind-boggling examples, but they have a true impact. And imagine the advanced economic output that little restaurant could have had at an important time of economic growth for the province. We'd like the RCT to think about adding mutual recognition of workers' compensation, again, from some of the examples I've already highlighted to the list, which is not currently on there. And lastly, to also look at mutual recognition of occupational health and safety issues. Again, this comes back to paperwork, registration. It just is time-consuming, and in some instances it can cost money as you try and deal with the varying areas. So CFIB's overarching priority is that red tape reduction principles should be followed when looking at the critical process of issue identification and then execution on these issues. Until Canadian business owners are able to feel an on-the-ground impact, the CFTA will remain a thick document full of exceptions that will end up as a doorstop for certain groups of interested trade nerds, myself among them. While it's encouraging that premiers and the federal government have all publicly supported moving forward on this file, what matters most to small businesses is that meaningful and swift action is taken to ensure an open and competitive marketplace within Canada. Thank you, and my colleague Corinne and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morrell, and we look forward to both of you answering questions. I'm going to introduce Ian Blue, our last panel member. Ian Blue is a senior counsel and advisor in energy and regulatory law administrative law, business law, and constitutional law issues at Gardner Roberts LLP in Toronto. He has appeared before all levels of courts in Ontario, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and the Yukon, and before both levels of the federal court. He has also appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada. Mr. Blue, we look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Senator Cody. And I just wanted to say, Senators, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's great to be back in this magnificent building, the Center Block. I was legislative counsel to the late Alan J. McKechnie when he was a federal minister, and I remained his legal advisor until he completed his time here in the Senate. So it's great to be back and to see senators again. I'm here not to throw cold water on everybody, but just to try to describe for everybody where we are in terms of the law on interprovincial trade in Canada. Now, up on the screen, I have a copy of Section 121 of the Constitution Act, and that is very clear. It states that all articles of growth product or manufacture of any one of the provinces shall be admitted free into any of the other provinces. My professional background is as a energy regulatory lawyer, where I do all the commercial constitutional stuff. So as that sort of a lawyer, I've always been aware of Section 121. But what occurred to me was that it had never, ever really been studied. So in 2011, I published a paper called Long Overdue, a Reappraisal of Section 121 of the Constitution Act, and it had it published in the Dalhousie Law Journal. It's a refereed publication. I received hundreds of emails from lawyers around the country, constitutional lawyers, who said that they thought the same thing and they completely agreed with my views on Section 121. Then I got a phone call that Mr. Comeau in New Brunswick, who had simply lived in Tracadie, New Brunswick, went across the bridge to Quebec, bought a couple of cases of beer, a couple of bottles of booze and some wine, and drove back and was arrested by the RCMP. And he was charged with violating Section 134B of the Liquor Act. So the Canadian Constitutional Association thought it would be a good idea to see if my ideas in Long Overdue might persuade the Supreme Court of Canada. So we worked, Dasha Perigodovo, who was sitting down there, my associate, and I worked very hard on putting the argument in our Supreme Court factums. And I really recommend that if you're interested in the view that Section 121 guarantees free trade, read that. But regretfully, the Supreme Court of Canada paid me the highest compliment ever. It ignored my argument. It did not deal with my argument or say that it was wrong. It couldn't do that, because the argument was supported by ample Supreme Court authority on every point. What's noticeable about the Comeau decision is that it does not cite one decision other than the ones on Section 121 that we cited in support of our position. It did not even refer to the argument or my paper. What it did instead was it created an alternative reality. Now, in 1920, in the Gold Seal case, Section 121 had been interpreted by the Supreme Court of Canada to prohibit only tariffs at the provincial border. As a result, all other interprovincial trade barriers were permitted. They did that to save a mismanaged proclamation of the Canada Temperance Act in Alberta. That's what it was about. And we told that to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had a full opportunity to completely reappraise Section 121, and it had a complete opportunity to open the free trade gates. And a lot of the parties that were intervened in support of Mr. Comeau are here today, and they provided superb counsel who supported this position. Could we just open up free trade legally a little bit? And the Supreme Court of Canada decided, in its wisdom, no. So that the end result is today, 2018, we are really guided by a temperance era decision. Now, I just want to highlight this. The Supreme Court of Canada's alternate reality was such that it said that an interpretation of Section 121 that would allow interprovincial free trade was, and quotation marks, they used the term radical. And the court also said that the words shall be admitted free in Section 121 were ambiguous. When I read that, I thought of Bill Clinton saying, it depends on what the definition of is. Nobody who I've spoken to outside the judges of the Supreme Court of Canada considers those words ambiguous. And history, we had called ample historical evidence by the foremost historian of the 19th century, economic historian of the 19th century, Dr. Andrew Smith, who said that the fathers of Confederation wanted unrestricted free trade. And they wanted it because the Americans, just like Donald Trump or the Republicans, had ended the reciprocity agreement of 1854. So the idea was get together and we could have internal free trade, and that will replace the U.S. market. That was the idea. The court just ignored that argument. They said it was, oh, that was just some historian's idea. And yet it was 3 days evidence at a trial. Now, what's interesting, in order to arrive at its alternate reality, the Supreme Court of Canada weaponized what it called the federalism principle. And it said the federalism principle meant that nothing can interfere with provincial autonomy and federal autonomy. Nothing else in the Constitution can interfere with the autonomy of provinces and the federal government. So what we're left with in 2018, as of last April 19th, is there is a new legal tension between those of us who believe in interprovincial free trade and provincial rights. Now, I want to tell you that in the proceedings before the Supreme Court, the 3 provinces who were most adamant about protecting their provincial rights were BC, Alberta, and Quebec. Okay? Nothing should be allowed to interfere, they said. Now, what did the Supreme Court of Canada say about interprovincial trade barriers? They said if a province passes a law that just prohibits goods from coming into the province, that's impermissible. Well, that was impermissible to start with under the Federal Trade and Commerce power. Provinces couldn't do that. So that wasn't very helpful. But then they said, but if that law has a valid provincial purpose, then that's okay. So I want to just ask you to try to imagine a provincial law that restricts the entry of goods or restricts the entry of goods into a province that could not be dressed up into valid provincial purpose. I can't think of one. Alberta was prohibiting, had a higher tariff on beer coming into Alberta than out of Alberta, but their valid provincial purpose is, oh, we want to encourage the Alberta beer industry. That would be legal. So that's where we are. The message from the Supreme Court of Canada is a message that, sorry, as far as interprovincial trade rules go, provincial rights trumps everything else. Now, obviously, if the court had opened up Section 121 only slightly It could have resulted in much easier free trade. It could have been a catalyst to other negotiations, and Canadians would have had all the benefits of doing so. But the court said no. So the message I'm bringing here today is we cannot look at the courts for help in obtaining free or interprovincial trade. And at this point, all decisions about interprovincial free trade are in the hands of elected officials. But don't lose hope. Don't lose hope, because there are some very positive signs. I mean, Senator Cody has said that the cost of the trade barriers, according to one study done by Alberta economists, is $130 billion. But our own Statistics Canada has said that our interprovincial trade barriers constitute a tax of about 6.9% on all goods sold. And they looked at the comparable analysis for the U.S. and found that there was virtually no tax. That is the cost of these barriers. But there are some good stories, and I'm just going to tell one more, Senator, before we go. As senators in the audience may know, between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, there is reciprocity in beer. People can take beer across the border, same price. When the Como trial decision came down, which said that Section 121 meant total free trade, New Brunswick lowered its beer price because it meant so it could compete with Quebec. And what did it find? It found that its revenue went up. That's a good story. Us lawyers, a legal profession, people don't think much of, but in terms of free trade, since 1990, we've had an agreement to respect provincial certification of one province in each other province. Lawyers, if they can do 10 cases or 10 deals in another province, as long as their insurance is paid up. Prior to 1990, one lawyer could not practice in another province. So we recognize that our law schools are all equivalent, and we should do the same with all our apprenticeships, all our training, and construction. I think I've gone over my time.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. You've been excellent. You've all brought different perspectives. Same ending, but different perspectives on how to get there. So we'll start with
Senator Munson, who rose his hands first.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for your testimony before us this morning. As senators, sometimes I don't know what we can do to change the landscape in terms of legislation, because we talk about provincial responsibilities, but we're here to represent provinces as well here in the federal environment. I'm from Hamilton, by the way, so New Brunswick, where Mr. Como is from. That's where I lived. I don't think anything has changed. Supreme Court or any Supreme Court, I'm sure that there's a free flow of goods that still exist across the Restigouche River between Pointe de Croix and Hamilton, New Brunswick. I wouldn't want to say, but you know, I'm looking at that line that you put in your slide before about this ambiguous. There's nothing ambiguous about any of this. I have so many questions, but I'd like to go back to what Mr. Beattie was talking about in the mutual recognition aspect, and I understand that these regulations now exist in Australia. And has any studies been done recently about how it has improved the economic wealth of Australia by having this mutual recognition of regulations in effect? And if so, could you tell us in what category? Because I think Canadians, nobody's jumping up and down. People are concerned about it, but it seems there's a lot of protectionism going on. I thought we were a free trading country, but we don't sound like an internal free trading country.
It's a very good question, Senator. I'm not aware of any study that's tried to aggregate the economic impact of that. But if we find anything,
do you have any idea how it has improved trade?
Only anecdotal, Senator. In the work we did in preparing for the Como case, we looked at certain studies, but they were more anecdotal rather than studious. Newspaper reports, press reports.
Just on the face of it, it's common sense that if you make it easier to do commerce, it encourages economic growth, and there'd be no reason to believe that the situation in Australia would be any different from that.
There's unrestricted free trade in the United States, from state to state, is there, or is there not?
For the most, I guess, and I would defer to Mr. Blue on this, but obviously there are regulatory differences between states which might affect the ability to move. Well, today's the day in which we've legalized marijuana in Canada. Legislation in terms of sale of cannabis in the United States varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There's some constraints there. That's different from what we've been talking about here.
I know senators have a lot of questions, but how did we get to this in the first place? I did back in the day in another role in my life, I did a news story in this in the late 90s. And people seemed to be very upset at that particular time, and there were a lot of news stories around that time, but nothing seems to have changed. I know that we have the CFTA, but how did we get to this protectionism? How did this begin when you talked about the Fathers of Confederation saying there should be free trade amongst the provinces? How did we get to this? And
it was really the Gold Seal case. The Gold Seal case said the Union government in 1920 messed up the proclamation of the Temperance Act in Alberta. And the argument was made that 121 prohibited the Temperance Act anyway because it restricted the ability to send booze from Alberta into Saskatchewan. And the only way that Justice Duff and the Supreme Court could get around that argument was to narrow the interpretation of Section 121. There was no legislative history. There was no evidence about what was intended. They just said, we think it means it restricts, it only restricts tariffs. Then the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council quoted Duff without really thinking about it, and it's sort of a bad decision kept getting perpetrated. Meanwhile, provincial lawyers would tell their provinces, there's nothing wrong if you want to stop Ontario construction workers from coming into Quebec, or Quebec construction workers from going into Ontario, then you have the legal authority to do it because there's no restriction on it. So I think the practice has just grown up and got worse. And then when the Supreme Court of Canada heard that wasn't intended, they said, oh, that's not the type of evidence that we will allow to change things. Why not? You did it in every other case, but not in this case.
Ms. Pullman?
And I would also say that over time, because of that, businesses got used to it being just a cost of doing business. But then these free trade agreements happened in the last few years, which suddenly sort of exposed the fact that we were going to have other countries able to do business in jurisdictions in Canada that other provinces weren't going to be able to do. And I think that kind of brought it to light again in a way that we hadn't seen in a while. Then, of course, the Como case, I think, brought again to light. And so I think we've seen a real resurgence in this when we see ourselves able to, and we've asked this question of our own membership, is it easier for you to trade into the United States than within Canada? And we have a good percentage of them saying it is easier to go into the U.S. than to some of the other provinces. So it's, as we continue to promote small companies to grow and expand and export, if you can't do it within your own country, you're probably not going to do it to another country. And so I think we really need to figure out a way to fix this. And I think the last several years has really highlighted that issue for us and why we see it more today than we have in the past, because it was always there, but it was a cost of doing business, but now it's much more exposed than it used to be.
Perspective on it, Mr. Blue said the legal basis in which this happened. I think your question may have also referred to what is the political basis in which this happened. And bottom line here, every special provision that you'll know from your experience as parliamentarians, every special provision has a special interest behind it that wraps itself very ably in rhetoric about the public interest. we can't possibly have competition because ... This would discriminate against local industry. Local tax dollars have gone into this. This is less safe. The product from somewhere else is inferior. What it is, and then the most egregious example, which is of course the issue of alcohol and the provincial liquor monopolies, they're giant cash cows for provincial governments. They don't want to give up that cash cow by liberalizing the sale of alcohol in Canada as a consequence. So it's another special interest. The provincial government may itself be a special interest that is protecting itself. And what's important here for you as federal parliamentarians is to say, is there a transcendent national public interest here that cuts across all of these localized special interests that we're talking about, and that says that when you have a system that limits consumer choice, that drives up the cost of doing business, that drives up the cost to consumers, that makes our businesses uncompetitive in global markets because we can't get the economies of scale here at home to be able to ramp up to the production that we need to sell globally, that this is antithetical to the national interest of Canada as a whole. And I think there's a real role for Ottawa to play in providing leadership here, moral leadership, in breaking down these barriers.
I know that other senators have many questions, but there's also mobility rights, and we use stories of other stories, but there were New Brunswick workers, and that's just one story, who wanted to do construction work or work in Montreal on a small-scale basis that lasted about 1 week at one site, because the unions in Quebec said, "You don't want to be working here, do you?" And they scampered back to New Brunswick. So the justification of protecting the workers' rights of Quebec against, even though they needed more workers to do this, the mobility rights of people to do what they want to do have been denied. So, I'll just leave it like that. I'm sorry.
Maybe second round, eh?
Sure.
So there's a Senator Mercer and Senator Gagné wants to ask a question.
I find it interesting. We've heard alternate reality, and we hear daily on television about fake news. I scribbled down a notice. Obviously, there's been too many lawyers involved in this whole process, because every lawyer seems to have a different opinion, and they found a way to put Mr. B's rights behind every change. There's a group who wrap themselves in some local flag that says, I have a practical question. Several of you mentioned workers' compensation, and I gather, if I interpret it correctly, is that workers' compensation, there's an agreement between the provinces that it can work across the board. What happens in the case of, and hopefully this won't happen, where a large number of workers from one province is working in another province, and a major accident happens? Who's paid? Is there? I'm looking for an example where something works there, because nothing else seems to. The workers are covered, but who pays?
So the way it works right now is if you have workers in another province, if they're there for, it depends on each province because every province has its own rules, but if they're there for longer than, say, 5 days, I think in Nova Scotia, then you have to register those workers in Nova Scotia. So you as an employer are required to register all your employees in every province in which they work after they've worked there for a certain amount of time, and it's usually just a matter of days, but it does vary from province to province. Our suggestion has been, why can't it work like we have our healthcare systems? Right now, if you relocate from one province to another, for up to 3 months, your previous province covers you until those 3 months are up, and then you flip over to that province's healthcare system. So we're suggesting, like, why can't we come up with a single solution across the country like that? So if you're only sending workers over temporarily, they're covered under your current system for 3 months. But if they stay there longer than 3 months, then you then have to register them in that province. But right now, it's different rules beneath each province. You have to register for each. Their costs are different for each province. So it really does vary from province to province. And it can be a real barrier for businesses that want to expand and move their employees across the country.
It's a fairly good example, because healthcare, I live in Nova Scotia. I have a health card from Nova Scotia. but I work here in Ontario, a fair amount of work. So I don't normally just get sick on the weekends. So I get a fair amount of my health care in Ontario. I've never once in the 25 or 30 years that I've been commuting back and forth to Nova Scotia, never once have been turned down for health care in Ontario. I show him usually my Nova Scotia health care. Is that the example that we need to use to beat each other over the head and say, look, it works for healthcare. Why can't it work for commerce?
That's certainly what we're trying to put on the table as one solution to address this particular issue, which right now is extremely different from province to province and complicated for a business owner who wants to expand. So.
We should acknowledge that there is one province that doesn't work with and that's with Quebec because of the different fee structure that they have from Ontario. I understand. I'm neither a Quebecer nor an Ontarian, but when I am in my Ontario doctor's office, there's signs indicating that Quebecers are treated differently because of the cost difference. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Gagné.
Merci. Thank you very much for your presentations. There are surveys that showed that I believe 90% of Canadians believe
You know what? There are about 90% of Canadians think that this is the interprovincial barriers are un-Canadian. The Canadians think that. You mentioned in your survey, I think it's 82% of your members think that it's ridiculous. We have, I think we know there's a cost to doing business because of the barriers. So describe the perfect storm that will give us the opportunity to break down those barriers. And what is that perfect storm?
Senator, speaking for myself, I echo Mr. Beatty's statement that there is a real role for the Senate to hold up the Como decision of the Supreme Court of Canada and say, you have really restricted a major constitutional power that could really benefit all Canadians and tied the hands of the courts in helping people reduce interprovincial trade barriers. The Como decision is a barrier, and if I talk about it, I'm a sore loser. If the Senate of Canada talks about it and says it's a problem for Canada's continued competitiveness and economic future, I believe it would be listened to. This is a very important point. Nothing much has to change. It's just that we could be so much better. Canadians could be so much better off if those barriers are removed. Our business could be so much more competitive. So I think if I can say anything, it's just throw light on the Como decision beyond the light that all the media criticized it. A lot of academics have criticized it, but I think the Senate of Canada should make its views known on it as well.
Thank you.
I might simply add, I admire Mr. Blue's directness on this, considering the fact that he has to go back in front of the Supreme Court probably sometime, and they may read this testimony. But we were interveners as well in that case, and we were equally disappointed and equally surprised by the decision. I was already making plans that if Mr. Como was successful, I was going to propose that his face be put on the $10 bill as the new father of Confederation. It was an incredible public service I felt he was providing by going across that bridge and bringing those cases of beer back. I don't know that the concern that people have expressed about the Como decision itself is going to be the triggering cause of people changing. It comes down to federal political leadership at the end of the day. And I understand the concern that federal politicians have about, obviously we're saying to the provinces here that in areas under provincial jurisdiction, we want to circumscribe their ability to act. Well, that's why we have a federal government. Mr. Trudeau Sr., when I was in Parliament, said that Ottawa had to be more than the head waiter to the provinces. There is a national interest here that transcends all sorts of geographic and other interests in Canada, and somebody has to speak for the nation. And there's a very real, palpable desire that surveys, whether of business or of the public, show that the Canadians believe that the barriers that we have in place today undermines our capacity to build truly a Canadian nation. We have to decide over a century and a half after Confederation whether we're one country or 13 satrapies who happen to be coexisting on contiguous landmass. And just on the issue, this is not so difficult. We were talking about mutual recognition. Well, let's give what one would think would be a much more difficult example. Motor vehicles. Each province, each territory, each state in the United States has different standards for getting your driver's license. And yet, you can take your car, no matter which province in Canada or territory you're from, you can drive anywhere in our two countries without being stopped. And you can use the license that you receive for your car with different standards for licensing from any of these jurisdictions. If it's possible to do that across 63 jurisdictions, why should we not, within Canada, be able to have mutual recognition in a wide range of areas where we simply say, there may be minor differences in terms of standards here, but we accept that the intent of the regulation is the same, and we respect the decision that's been made by the other jurisdiction here and accept the license that's been given.
If you want to go on, Senator?
If there are other questions, maybe in second round I could ask another question.
I would like to add to this debate that we have about the leadership creation, because I think it's very, very important, and also because it has been so long that we realize that we have a problem of trade within Canada. So I'm wondering, do you know how in Australia they go about it? Do you know that what I read about it is that they have a lot of conversation between the federal and the provincial on economic problems. If I don't know how they got that going on, but I think if the courts are not the way to go, then dialogue is the way to go. But how to create this dialogue, I think, is the question.
In Australia, their constitution says that goods shall be admitted absolutely free from one state into another. That's the wording of their constitution. But contrary, quite differently than Canada, they have had a huge amount of litigation over the years on what that means in particular contexts. And the decisions are conflicting and irreconcilable. And each decision applies to a specific situation, but you cannot generalize what the rules are in Australia. That's a legal situation. Go ahead.
So my response to that is, I don't know exactly how it works in Australia, but I agree with you. It's about talking and the conversation, which is why I think we were excited about the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, because it was the first time in many years that the leaders, the premiers as well, got together and said, we're going to do something about this. And I completely agree with everything Mr. Beatty said around the fact that it's about political leadership. So that's where we felt, okay, here are the provinces, because ultimately it's going to be up to them to come to the table. But it's interesting, even our own membership, who can sometimes be somewhat protectionist of their own regions of Canada, 91% of them told us that the federal government needs to play a leadership role in this area, so which surprised us even to some degree. So I do think the federal government, and I understand it can be challenging for them to do this, but they do need to play a critical role in trying to keep the provinces focused, and it does come to the political leadership. It does have to be important to the premiers and to the Prime Minister, in my opinion, in order to move this thing forward, because nothing will get done if it's left in the hands of the officials at the bureaucratic level. And that's, I think, ultimately what has to be done. So we're cautiously optimistic is probably the right word. In the last premiers meeting, Council of Federation meeting, they designated 2 premiers to sort of take the lead on this. I believe it's Premier Pallister and Premier Nova Scotia, McNeil, which I think are 2 that are fairly strong in this area, and so we're hopeful that something will come out of that. But we're losing patience as well. So I think you're going to find groups like us calling them a lot more vigorously around where is the results. We want to see results, because they're going to lose the room pretty quickly if we don't see some good results in the next little while. So I agree, it's got to be about dialogue, but it's also got to be driven by the people at the top.
Do you have a comment?
No, I just fully agree. Yes, we have to have an open dialogue, and I believe in cooperative federalism. That seems to be our goal. But at some point, 150 years later, where we haven't been able to make progress that satisfies Canadians, somebody has to speak for the national interest. And I would just simply say to all of you who are federal parliamentarians, if you are prepared to provide leadership in terms of calling upon the provinces and the territories to take down these barriers and to treat us as one nation and one market, you will have our full support as a Canadian Chamber of Commerce across the country. And I think you'll find that with all areas of business. And that certainly includes mobility of persons as well. Mr. Black made the point we have mobility of lawyers in Canada. We can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But let's extend the same mobility to, Mr. Blue pointed at it, and correctly, and it's a good thing in my view. But let's extend that across the board to all Canadians, that they have the capacity to use their skills across the country, and that we treat ourselves as one country. The most egregious, by the way, Mr. Munson mentioned construction war between New Brunswick and Quebec. The most celebrated case was here in Ottawa, between Ottawa and Hull, as I recall, a street torn up because workers from Ontario had crossed the bridge and gone across. It's silliness. And it's very similar to local procurement provisions. And I can give you, BD's first rule of procurement is it's never the guy with the best product at the lowest price who argues that you shouldn't have competition. And it is always the taxpayer who loses when you put restrictions on.
It's a scary comment, but unfortunately it's true. We're going to take a couple of questions from our visitors at the back, and then we'll come back to the table for more dialogue. Our first questioner from the audience is Mr. Ron Barr. He's the CEO and General Manager of Greater Ottawa Truckers Association, and he has a question for our panelists this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having us, and thank you for convening in this group. I've got many questions, but I'll keep it short. I'm hearing a lot of comments. My background, I run the Greater Ottawa Truckers Association. I've been active in the interprovincial trade. I've literally blocked bridges between Ottawa and Hull because of the inequity. We're talking about people trade here. I've attended Minister Moore's session when he was in the Harper government about this subject. Our issue is the inequitable position of workers coming into Ontario. I negotiated at the time with the City of Ottawa for the snow. When I got the list, when I took over, I discovered there was 23 different companies from Quebec registered to move City of Ottawa snow, and I was astounded by that. So I took it to Mayor Watson at the time and did very little. Mr. Blue, I'd like to ask you a question with regards to if you are familiar with the Discriminatory Businesses Practice Act. That was presented to me by Watson as a reason why he couldn't prevent a non-resident from applying for a job at the City of Ottawa. Now, before you answer that, I want to just have a discussion. So we have all of these workers coming into Ontario to the point where I had a meeting with Minister Yazir Naqvi at the time, the Minister of Labour for Ontario. And we had a discussion with regards to all the workers. I even had resistance from the Ontario Construction Association. They say we're so dependent on the Quebec workers to build Ontario that they went against our thrust to protect Ontario workers. So my question to you, Mr. Blue, if you know, because it's been presented to me a number of ways, can you tell me just a brief example of the Discriminatory Businesses Practices Act in preventing Mayor Watson from preventing a Quebecer coming? And two more facts I want to point out. There was 1,901 people working for the City of Ottawa from Gatineau addresses, none the other way, and 45% of our nurses in Ontario are filled with Quebec nurses, not too many the other way. So can you tell me what the Discriminatory Businesses Practices Act?
I can't tell you about the Act, but certainly the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would prevent any provincial government from restricting someone from coming into the province and working in another province. The mobility rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantee that, and the Supreme Court of Canada has so held. But subject to provincial licensing.
All right. What about, now this is a question, but what about union protections? They seem to throw up unions. If we want to go into Quebec to work from Ontario, you know, there's a lot of union activity, there's a lot of rules and regulations. They come into Ontario and build our province. We can't reciprocate and go over. One of the suggestions I made to Minister Nakvi is we get the youth that are not motivated to this day, that have become basically dependent on governments, most of them, to get them into the trades, to get them graduated in 4 years, so they're replacing the aging Quebec workers that are building Ontario, and get them working and build ourselves. A couple of other points.
Could you step just a little bit back from the mic, because we're getting feedback?
You know what? I used to be a racetrack announcer, so I got that aggressive voice. And I own a winery as well, so I'm very concerned about this. I own a winery in Elmer, Ontario, and, you know, I can't even trade wine in BC. But, you know, one of the things that always amazes me, my grocery store, my corner stores will be full of South African wine, and every wine except for mine. Correct, Mr. Blue? That's what it's coming to. I can't sell my wine up the corner store, but everybody else around the world can come in there. So I applaud you guys for doing this, because it's starting to hit home. I also had to go through to find out through the Jobs Protection, which you're familiar with, Mr. Blue, which is the governing body that an Ontario can go through to make sure the paperwork and everything's compliant to get work into Quebec. I've talked to that office. They say the situation, the inequitable position, one way to the other, is enormous right now. It's on fire and it's boiling. So we have to do something sooner than later, because my truckers, they're annoyed with having a city being built and basically controlled by the Quebec workers. So these guys want to do something else. We don't want to. We want to do it this way. But enough is enough. But again, we've got to. Once we open the borders, we've got to be able to address the unions that are going to be in the way to say you come through our door or you don't come in. So I just want to make that point. But I applaud you guys for doing this. Sarah, I'd like to thank for the invitation to be here. Thank you.
Any comments by panelists? Mr. Blue?
Yeah, my understanding is about, again, this is based on my professional experience and with clients doing business in Quebec in unions, that usually what happens if Ontario workers go to work, three union members, probably over 6 feet tall, smoking cigars, surround them and say, "Do you really want to work here?" Okay.
Or the enforcement has been, and we have been stopped going in there compliant as many as 6-7 times a day. A lot of our guys have just backed up. It's not worth the grief, and yet the Quebecers come into here. So that's something we're always going to hold firm on, and it's got to be addressed, especially the union activity. But thank you very much for being here. Brilliant, brilliant forum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wick. Go ahead, Mr. Beatty.
No, on this, and that on the issue of federal leadership again, because what we're seeing here is that protectionism breeds protectionism. What we're hearing is if there are restrictions on our workers going across provincial boundaries, well, then we're going to put restrictions on people from the other jurisdiction coming into here. That's, somebody has to cut that Gordian knot. And that's the role of federal leadership, to say this makes no sense in a federation like Canada for us to put those boundaries in place. Then on the subject of the restrictions on wine, economists have studied these restrictions very carefully, and they have a technical term for it: dumb.
One more thing, if I may. There was a fairness is a two-way street between the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, was repealed in 06 by McGuinty and Charest governments. There was supposed to be a study commenced and is supposed to be released 5 years later in 2011. Has anybody requested that study? Because I'm told it's written by the person, the author of that, and they said, make sure you dissect that. They were told to write it a certain way to really skew the numbers. Dig deep into those numbers and you're going to find some issues. Has anybody requested that document that was supposed to be released in 2011? Okay, I'm going to request it from the Freedom of Information Act, but that will be an important study for this because it talks about the repeal and the success or failure of fairness as a two-way street. Thank you again.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, nous allons passer à
Now, Mr. Dan Pasowski.
Vintner Association. Bonjour.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. I never turned down an invitation to talk about this topic, representing 700 wineries in this country. I've been working on this for over 13 years to remove the barriers to interprovincial trade for wine. So I'm glad to see on the day that marijuana has been legalized, that alcohol has been a major topic around this table, including from a wine producer in the province of Quebec. I mean, our most recent numbers, and this is just a couple of weeks back from Ipsos, is 91% of Canadians believe that governments should be working together to remove interprovincial barriers to alcohol trade. 91%. You'd think that number, the politicians would get together and believe that this is the right thing to do because Canadians want this. But going back in history, I started off working with the liquor boards. The liquor boards all disagreed that we should do this. It had to be a provincial decision. The provinces, once the liquor boards talked to them, decided not to take any action. So we took this to the federal level. Dan Albus put together Bill C-311 to amend federal law. Unanimous consent in both houses to move this forward. What happens? 3 provinces agree to amend their laws: British Columbia, Manitoba, and Quebec. And no different than you mentioned, Ian, in the province of New Brunswick, wine sales increased in each of those 3 provinces. So, what the liquor board stated, this would displace sales in liquor boards and reduce revenue for the provinces was absolutely false. In the province of Quebec, the largest wine-consuming province in the country, 0.25% wine sales market share is 100% Canadian wines. The biggest tourists in the province of Ontario to the Niagara region are Quebec residents, but they're not allowed to. They enjoy the wine. They can't find it in the province of Quebec, but they can't order it and have it delivered to the province either. So we're very, we worked, and we get the Canada Free Trade Agreement. Alcohol is not included in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, but a decision is taken to establish a 12-month federal, provincial, territorial alcohol beverage working group. Studied for 12 months, we put together a legislative proposal on how this could work that meets internal legal reforms, meets international law requirements, and then provincial premiers meet on July 18th, and coming out of that meeting, as many of you know, the decision was that, we'll consider doubling the personal exemption. When Bill C-311 was passed, the provinces didn't want to look as if they were restricting their consumers from bringing alcohol into the province. So they put in place a personal exemption. New Brunswick has 1 bottle. They don't mention the size of that bottle, but it's 1 bottle. Most provinces put in 1 case. So you're allowed to bring in 1 case of wine on your person for personal consumption. I don't know if anybody's traveled from British Columbia to Ontario with a case of wine in their trunk. It's not going to be very good by the time they get back home. But by doubling that, what's that do? A resident in Kitchener has to travel 550 kilometers to Quebec to bring 2 cases of wine back with them, or to Manitoba to 1,500 kilometers to bring it back with them. It doesn't make sense. So in terms of the conversation around the table today with internal trade ministers meeting on the 25th, so next week, we do have the mandate letter to the new federal minister responsible for internal trade, who after the Premier's conference in July did state that he didn't think the premiers went far enough with doubling the personal exemption. He felt that interprovincial direct-to-consumer delivery was the appropriate path forward, which we completely agree with. But if this requires a political decision, a political capital put behind this, with 91% of Canadians agreeing, does it make sense to attach an annex to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, to allow those currently 3 provinces to sign on to that annex with a legislative proposal that establishes the rules of the game, how wineries or couriers could be licensed, tax collection, assurances that this will meet internal and international law obligations, a form of reciprocity between provinces that provinces could sign on to. Could that be the first step to finally getting that political will to make this happen? Because from what we've seen over the past 13 years, getting all 13 jurisdictions on site at the same time is absolutely impossible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next comments? Mr.
One thing the Senate could do, the Senate can initiate bills. We've all known that, as long as they're not money bills. But I suppose you might stretch the rules slightly and have a bill to create the office of the Canadian Internal Trade Commissioner. And debate that bill in the Senate, and then take it to the House of Commons and see what the Commons does with it. I was a political assistant long enough to know that no federal government ministers or prime ministers are going to take on the internal trade deal. They're going to talk about it, and they're all going to say we should do better, but no one's going to challenge Ontario or Quebec or British Columbia directly, because no matter what party you're in, you've got seats there, and they don't want provincial premiers against them. So I think what you need is almost a proconsul official that has the authority to negotiate and bring about pursue interprovincial trade to the extent of federal powers. And an official like that, if anyone remember Pierre Junot when he was chair of the CRTC? He shamed broadcasters into having more Canadian content. Before that, they didn't do that. You need an official like that can shame provinces into changing their rules. But one way to bring attention to it and profile to it would be that Senate bill.
Very interesting. Any other comments?
That's a very interesting idea. There can be a race of the senators who are here today to get to the legislative draftsman's office after this meeting.
I can have the bill to you on Monday morning.
And can I ask a question to Mr. Blue about this idea? Would you see also around the table with this commissioner stakeholders that are not politicians, like business unions?
Well, you would no. You would do what used to be known in the trade as a C.D. Howe bill. You would say there's the Office of the Trade Commissioner. The Office of the Trade Commissioner has the power to make regulations respecting a whole list of topics, which would include consultation with First Nations, consultation with stakeholders, consultation with the provinces, and give him as wide and extensive powers as federal law permits, as the federal Constitution permits, to bring about this aim of improving trade laws. The agreements themselves, you could give him power to negotiate the agreements on behalf of the federal government, but I don't know if the federal government would accept that. I'm thinking out loud here.
Yes, yes, and I'm thinking also my question out loud, because if you create that kind of a commissioner with an office, then it's a money bill, isn't it?
We would. You can argue that it isn't. The government may tell you that it is, and then you say, "Well, fine. We've given you the bill. You introduce it in the House of Commons." And then you can have the. Then I believe that you would probably have Canadians behind you. You would have the media behind you. Say, "Why don't we do this?"
I think a crawler into that as well, is that the commissioner would be given the authority to report and on this issue of shaming jurisdictions, to be able to have an annual report or a special report from the commissioner pointing out some of the most egregious examples of where jurisdictions have been recalcitrant and where it's denying consumer choice or mobility in Canada, could increase that leverage, the moral leadership that the federal government could
report to Parliament rather than to the government, yes.
I think it's worthwhile thinking on. Thank you.
Next, we have Senator Deakin, the newest senator from Nova Scotia. And is this your first Open Caucus meeting?
I just wanted to compliment you on the Open Caucus. It is my first one. I'm very sorry I was otherwise engaged early on. And I just think this approach is fantastic, where we get a chance to really hear firsthand about issues that are really important to the country. And this is one that's central to our productivity as a country. I mean, it's, Canada is going to not be able to deliver on all of our crucial social and economic priorities if we do not continuously increase our productivity. If we're protecting jobs because they're less productive in one jurisdiction of our country, we are actually undermining our productivity.
Why weren't you appointed before now? It's a very welcome voice.
We actually met in very early in the 80s when you were a bright, shiny new MP. and it's great to see you still fighting for the same issues as you were 35 years ago. So it's fantastic. I'm here as a startup entrepreneur. I spent my life commercializing tech companies, which is defined as locally, startups are locally controlled. They're commercializing an idea or intellectual property, and they're into global sales. And if that's the focus, and you can't do that successfully unless you compete globally. So for me, global competitiveness is crucial to our economy and to protecting Canadian jobs. So I look at this issue absolutely opposite to what our elected politicians seem to look at it. They're looking at short-term protection versus long-term empowerment and protection. So that's the way I'm seeing this. I love the idea that you just put forward, because I think it would add, it would potentially, if it's something that we could find a way through. I mean, I have a view that maybe many politicians and public servants don't view money as being spent on bureaucrats' salaries. They view it as what's being transferred to the provinces and individuals. That's money. The rest is just the cost of doing business. So maybe we could get around it. But I love the idea of doing something to bring attention to this on an ongoing basis, and to show how this is actually undermining the long-term productivity and economic security of Canadians, and the security of our social services that we all value so deeply, our healthcare system, our university system, our research. So I just wanted to say I love the idea. I love the conversation. I think it's so important. I want to just speak to one particular thing. In the province of New Brunswick, there's equity tax credits. In the province of Nova Scotia, there's equity tax credits. Those are used to, when startup founders start a new business, they'll raise money from angel investors in their community, and if an angel investor puts in some money, they get a tax credit back from the province if they're resident in that province. But if I was to invest in a business in New Brunswick from Nova Scotia, I wouldn't get the equity tax credit. The investor from Nova Scotia would. It means they pay $1.50 a share, where I'd pay $1.50 a share, they'd pay $1. We don't have interprovincial trade in establishing the future of our economy in these startup businesses. That to me is, again, not allowing our smartest money to travel to our best opportunities in this country, to have our economy building the best businesses possible. But interestingly, if I was to invest in a startup business in Arkansas, which people don't have a lot of regard for Arkansas, or a lot of knowledge of it, it's got some amazing initiatives that they're doing to try and create opportunity in that state. If I was to invest in a startup business in Arkansas, I would get a 30% tax credit back as a Nova Scotia resident. They are accepting investment from outside of their state, which only makes sense. You want the smartest investors from anywhere in the world to be investing in your startup companies and helping you to succeed. But we don't even allow it from the next province. That's insane, because startup companies are the future of our economy. So there are some great examples that we could do some highlighting of that I think would show how ludicrous things are and maybe get the public to put a little bit more pressure on this issue, maybe embarrass politicians a bit more into to taking the tough stand. I know it's got challenges in some sectors that are harder than other sectors, but overall, this is something about productivity. Anyway, I want to say thank you for the conversation. I think it's so important, and it's great to have the people at the table on all fronts.
Not sure if there was a question there, but is there anybody who would like to make a comment on his questions?
On second round, I think we have the...
I believe Senator Bussenich, our first Open Caucus meeting as well.
It is as well. Myself and Senator Deakin are in the same position, and I too am just blown away by the conversation. Coming from British Columbia, I come from a position of having been observer to a lot of the things that are being talked about today. Alcohol and wine, of course, is near and dear to British Columbians' heart. And just as an example from my perspective, now I'm becoming a connoisseur of Air Canada travel, and just a small thing. When you get a glass of wine on an Air Canada airplane, it's not Canadian wine, it's not BC wine, it's from France. And I've asked around, and I finally, as of today, figured out why. These little things are big things. That is a huge opportunity to promote Canadian wine around the world. And at the same time, it's prohibited, and probably through this protectionist issue. You go to Alberta, and you don't see BC apples in Alberta. You see Washington apples in Alberta. The kinds of things that you see, because there are these protectionist issues, are, I think most people in Canada are vastly unaware of the money that's being lost, and the kinds of things that need to happen. And whether we use I love the approach too of having someone responsible at the federal level to move these things forward and nurture the issue, but I think we need to make people generally more aware, and that's easy to say and really difficult to do. I understand that. But I think that's important. And I was wondering if someone had mentioned, I think it was you, Mr. Blue, talking about the Supreme Court of Canada issues. And it scares me to think of how much litigation will certainly come from these moves that we make, and whether or not part of the strategy, along with having a commissioner to deal with these issues, is to maybe somehow formulate a referral to the Supreme Court of Canada on the issue, so that we're not forever litigating this as we move forward. This is just off the top of my head, and at the risk of sounding like I don't know what I'm talking about, I'll leave it.
Well, 2 points. One is, my wife and I, who frequently visit BC to go hiking and just enjoy a lovely, lovely province, have always marveled that why can't we get some of the lovely BC wines that we enjoyed in British Columbia in Ontario? I mean, Blue Mountain Pinot Noir is one of my favorite wines. You cannot get that in Ontario. And why can't British Columbians sample some of our fine Ontario wines? Nova Scotia makes some lovely wines, but you can't get them outside of Nova Scotia. Quebec, I understand, has some vintages. When we were before the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Justice Rowe from Newfoundland said, "Oh, Mr. Blue, if we acceded to your rule, there's 20 workers at the brewery at St. John's who would lose their jobs." And the answer I gave him was, Justice Rowe, if they make slightly better beer, they would have a national market, and you could probably have 60 or 70 people working there. And he just put down his pen and looked the other way. It was a very, very protectionist monopoly. So that's one thing. In terms of the Supreme Court of Canada and litigation is over. Nobody, in my view, who goes to a lawyer would be advised to challenge a trade barrier in court, because the argument's going to be, sure, it's a trade barrier, but if we go to court, the government of that province is simply going to say there's a valid provincial purpose, and that's a complete answer. Court's out. You need the provincial trade proconsul to draw attention to those situations, to the Como decision, to the lack of leadership previously, and to provide the leadership. And I think that you would start moving the goalpost forward.
We are in the second round, and I think Senator Munson raised, and then Senator Gagné, and Senator Mercer.
I was just thinking on international flights on business class, Air Canada will offer Canadian wine. But on domestic flights, on economy, they will offer up this French wine, which you really have to be thirsty to buy it. I just don't understand who makes those decisions, but that's not the question I have. It's still back to mobility rights, and you talked about lawyers. I just have to get this straight. They can practice, for example, an Ontario lawyer, a friend of mine is able to practice in Prince Edward Island, but not in New Brunswick, but because he picked up, I forget how that works. So in terms of mobility rights, can any lawyer from Ontario practice in any province in this country? Can an engineer, can an architect carry on his or her practice in any province in New Brunswick, or is that still being denied?
Lawyers, the answer is yes. As long as your professional liability insurance is paid and you are a member of the bar of one province, you may do up to, if you're a litigator like me, you can argue at least 10 cases per year in another single province if you want. If you're a commercial lawyer, you can do up to 10 deals, no problem. New Brunswick, your province, when I was acting for the New Brunswick government, requested that I write a letter asking their permission. I wrote the letter and I got their permission, but I really didn't have to. Prince Edward Island used to have a rule that to be a member of the Prince Edward Island bar, you had to be born in Prince Edward Island. Now that's gone by the way with this 10-province agreement. And what have they found? That, my goodness, PEI lawyers can now practice in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario, and everyone's doing better. Engineers are different. Engineers that are licensed, say an Alberta engineer that wants to work on an LNG project in Nova Scotia, would have to get licensed by the Nova Scotia Association of Professional Engineers. I don't think that's an onerous provision. Doctors are the same way. Doctors have to be licensed by the Provincial Medical Association, and those are just union rules. They're just union rules to protect the business of the local engineers and the local medical profession. But if those professions had the same rules as lawyers, they would find that they all do better.
The other issue around labor mobility is not just once you're trained, it's while you're being trained that's an issue. So if you're starting your training, for example, in the trades in one province, but in the middle of that training you want to move to another province, you may have to start over from the beginning, because the way they structure their training, the amount of time you need to do in the field, when you do certain courses, changes from province to province, and it can be very complicated for someone to transfer from one province to the other when it comes to certain types of trades. So that's the other piece of labor mobility. It isn't only about once you've actually achieved your degree or your apprenticeship, it's also once you're in the training process itself, it can be very different from province to province. So I think that's another piece of this that needs to be looked at very closely.
Senator Gagné? Vous remercier. We want to co-chair. She'll be representing the ISG, the Independent Senator Group, and replacing Senator Saint-Germain. Et nous remercions la sénatrice Saint-Germain.
And we want to thank Senator Saint-Germain, and we welcome Senatrice Gagné. Thank you indeed. I'm delighted to be able to share this role with Senator Cordier and Senator Bellemare.
labor mobility, it's a lot has to do with the professional orders or the professional association. Je pense l'ordre des infirmières is.
For instance, the Order of Nurses or the Nurses Professional Association.
Give you just a sense of the things they're asking. For example, I'm from Manitoba. My hopefully eventual daughter-in-law, who knows? Anyways, she's yeah. Well, I don't know yet. Anyways, my son's partner, let's put it that way, is moving. She has been offered a job and she's from Quebec. Offered a job in Manitoba. Just because in a bilingual or French setting, we're looking for very competent French speakers in different professions there, so she has a job offer. Well, the fact that she graduated from a Quebec university, even if she can demonstrate that she has English speaking skills, she still has to write an English exam, which is, I must say, because I have studied the exam, or the university where I was working, did study the content of the exam and the level of English proficiency. A lot of Manitobans could probably not pass the test, successfully.
I'd have to look at the test and look at the regulation, but on its face, I do not think that requirement would stand up in court.
Well, that's a good point, because we were debating if that should be, if we should pursue that question. But anyways, that was not my question. That was just my comment. And this is just a thought-provoking question. Do Canadians get anything positive out of interprovincial barriers?
Well, go ahead. No, the answer to that is, as the senator or someone has said this morning, each of these trade barriers is as a result of some interest whispering in the politician's ear. Okay? So obviously, there's somebody benefits, but at the expense of all Canadians. The 20 brewery workers in St. John's benefit, but at the expense of all Canadians now. So they look at it as a zero-sum game, and interprovincial free trade, like free trade around the world, is not a zero-sum game. It can uplift everybody and be more beneficial. And certainly Canada would have a lot more credibility in international trade negotiations if it could say that we have solved the problem ourselves in our federal jurisdiction.
If I could just really second what Mr. Blue has said, there is always a special interest that benefits from special provisions. And my experience in my years in politics was that we are, as human beings, past masters of rationalization. I would often have people come into my office and say, we've got to close down immigration in Canada. We have too many people coming across the borders. And then they would say, except my brother-in-law, who I want to bring in, or my colleagues who represent business will know that we often hear from business people say that there's too much federal spending here, too many federal programs. However, in my case, there's a special case here that has to be considered, and we have a little jog here to respect my circumstances. And that's why, again, it requires the political leadership, particularly at the national level, to say, look, there's a transcendent public interest here, that every time that you recognize the role of a special interest and give them special rights, it's at the expense of the general public.
Senator Mercer? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Excuse me, just very briefly, but to make maybe too fine the point, when we were negotiating the CETA agreement, it wasn't that the goodwill of the federal government that invited the provinces to the table, which was a first. That was the Europeans who had asked for that and said, we're tired of, we see what happens, and the excuse of, well, we'll do it here and then go back to the provinces and they'll put up their barriers isn't going to work. And they have already done it with 26 countries. So we're bordering on embarrassing, and there are other governments that have dealt with this with their own subnational governments. And we're going to get left behind if we keep it up like this. And to the point of the zero-sum game, well, we could ask Steve Rahul, our Canadian negotiator, you can't negotiate like that. And they don't on the international scale. And so why are we doing it like that here? So does anyone benefit? Well, we've talked about that, and maybe we'd have some members who would, who don't trade or don't see the benefit in it or can't think of how they would get their product across a border. But that's a limiting view, and they would probably support the notion that, as we've seen through some of our other survey data, that there is economic benefits to be gained by letting others do it, and I think that's the perspective we have to maintain.
Thank you. Senator Mercer?
The interesting thing is to talk about a trade commissioner, and it's a really good idea, except that if it comes from the Senate and is proposed, then if it were ever approved, somebody's got to pay them. So there's a dollar amount attached to it. So it can't come from the Senate. It's got to be initiated from the House of Commons. So how do you do that? I'm going to give a part of an answer, and then I'll let have you comment. Because I'm the most partisan senator around the table. My background has been in politics for a long time. What do they listen to down the hall in the House of Commons? They listen to what's good for my people at home. We talked about what happened when he was a member of Parliament. People would come in and they'd complain about other people, but I have my own idea. But politicians respond to a couple of things. Yes, this means votes for me, but more importantly, for almost all of them, this is good for the people in my area. That's what motivates almost every politician who sits in the House of Commons. So it's all about packaging. How do we package this so that it says there are jobs here for Nova Scotians, there are jobs here for Albertans, there are jobs here for Manitobans, etc. So that politicians, so you have to package what we're talking about in a way that is positive. Is in the current environment, no prime minister, no leader of a major political party is going to take this on because he or she sees that, well, I'd hope to pick up seats in Quebec in the next campaign, or I hope to pick up seats in Ontario in the next campaign, and they wouldn't take those risks. So we have to put it in another format. However, there are some examples of how it works. Training is a significant area. For example, now and this is very real to my province, and Senator Cordy's province, and Senator Deacon's province of Nova Scotia, where thousands and thousands of our young people have gone to work in Alberta. That's declined a lot in the downturn in the oil sector for a few years. I have a young friend, a guy who was best man at my wedding. His son was studying to be an electrician. Was working in Halifax, but then got a job in Fort McMurray, and was still an apprentice. Went out there, and now because there's an agreement between the province of Nova Scotia and the province of Alberta, his hours that he was putting in as an apprentice in Alberta count towards his journeyman status as an electrician in Nova Scotia. That works for Alberta. That works for Nova Scotia. So that's how you package it. How you package this so that it is as cruel as this is. Politicians are very selfish. They're very selfish about protecting their people, very selfish about protecting their voters, and they're very protective of protecting people they think are going to be their voters. And so you need to figure out how you package this so that it becomes attractive to them. The example you gave about the increase somebody gave about the increase in wine sales when agreements were made between provinces. That's very significant. However, I also know that if you go to, there's no agreement between Nova Scotia and British Columbia, or at least there wasn't the last time I was in British Columbia, about the sale of wine from one province to the other. Although I know I went into a winery in British Columbia, saw something I liked, bought a case of it. By the time I got back to Nova Scotia a week later, it was sitting on my front step, and it's quite frankly illegal. It was, but it happens. So people of commerce are finding ways around these things. It's not they're not. But if the rules were changed, you, Mr. Blue, could get some more of that good British Columbia wine, and somebody from British Columbia get some of that not so bad wine from Ontario, or even that great wine from Nova Scotia. So, because see, I just did it. I did the same thing that every politician. I'm here to represent Nova Scotia. I'm going to talk about how good my wine is, and your wine's not too bad, but it's not as good as mine. You know, I mean, that's what happens in this place all the time.
Is there any comment? And if not, Senator Deacon who wants also to intervene.
What I want to say is, I mean, I think it's all well and good to try to get the federal government to take a bigger role, but you still need the provinces on board. And we do have a Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which is a little over a year and a half old, so relatively young still, which did improve things. It is a negative list approach. There is this group now, the Regulatory Reconciliation and Cooperation Table, that's been established. There are representatives from every province. They're the group that is meant to create find the ways to harmonize or mutually recognize regulations. And that's the group that is in place now that I think we need to give an opportunity to make progress. I have my doubts about whether the structure right now is the best structure, but it's there and everybody's agreed for it to work in that realm. So I feel like we need to also give it a chance, but also give it a push as to what we need them to do. And really, it's a little bit hidden now, unfortunately, but that's the group that is working supposedly every day on trying to figure out ways, and there's representatives from every province and territory and the federal government in that group. So I feel like that's where we need to focus efforts, right? First and foremost, because it is a fairly new agreement still. I personally am worried that it's not progressing as well as it could because of the structure. Are the people senior enough? Do they have enough authority that's there? Those are the things I think we can look at and tweak and hopefully make this thing a more effective tool. Because, you know, we know some premiers are gripped with this, not all, but some. We believe the federal government thinks this is an important mandate, so it's really about continuing to remind these folks, those leaders, that they have to keep their eyes on the prize, and hopefully that team can be given the authority it needs to continue to move forward.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, ça va être...
Thank you very much.
As a human being than I am in their assessment of provincial governments. At the risk of introducing another controversy into this discussion, what I learned from the Trans Mountain debacle is that you can't count on provincial governments to speak for the national interest. Criticizing them for not speaking for the national interest, like criticizing Loblaws for not selling cars, it's not the business they're in, and so somebody else has to do that job. We do have a lot invested in the interprovincial mechanisms that have been put in place. We hope they'll be successful, but just on the basis of the experience of the last 150 years, I'm reminded of F.R. Scott's poem WLMK, which some of you will remember, where he has the line, postpone, postpone, abstain, do nothing by halves that can be done by quarters. This adequately describes the leadership that's been shown at the provincial level in breaking down these provincial barriers.
Senator Deacon, and it's going to be the last question or comment.
I'll try not to I'll restrain my comments, but I'm somewhat off my soapbox now, but it's such an important issue. I don't view this as anything less than protecting every job in Canada in the future. It's nothing less than that. And so I just want to understand the barriers. Quickly, number one, a little bit more around the individuals affected around the skills, where there are interprovincial barriers in terms of skills that cause that reduced labor mobility, number one. And number two, is there a really creative way that we could take your idea, Mr. Blue? Because I think this is about not having the issue in the media randomly, because of Mr. Como or others who have taken it on, but it's have it in the media regularly that we're always being hit with how crazy this situation is and how it's undermining us. So that one to each of you, one specifically on what are this. I respect it when individuals' labor mobility is reduced because of some silly local requirement around a skill that is unnecessarily and not justifiable. That's one issue, and the other is there a creative way we could go at the idea you put forward?
There is a creative way of doing it.
I wanted.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. On the skills side, it really, I mean, that's part of the issue is that it does vary so much from province to province. I do know in Atlantic Canada, among the 4 provinces, they've been working together to try to deal with labor mobility within those 4 provinces. And I would even say that Atlantic Canada's made progress where other provinces have not, to actually sit down and look at curriculums and say, okay, are our curriculums similar so people don't have to change course if they want to move to the province next door, and we can continue to move them forward. So it's mostly in the trades that we see that, and I know there's been a lot of work done in those provinces to try to actually sit down and think about the courses and the course sequence. So I think that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the skills that are needed, and I think that the rest of Canada could probably learn a little bit from what Atlantic Canada is trying to do in that regard. So.
In response to the question of whether there's a creative way of doing this, yes, there is. The idea occurred to me this morning as I was thinking about it. My job for Alan McKechnie was, when he was House Leader, I was responsible for advising on parliamentary procedure. I used to have Bourneau and Bouchain memorized. Yes, there is a way to write the Senate bill in a way that is constitutional. There is a way to write it to meet Senator Mercer's comments of making elected politicians in the House of Commons wince if they oppose it, and to sell it. There is a way of doing that, and it would not take a great deal of time. But have I thought it all through as I'm sitting here this morning? No, I haven't. I would have to go back to my desk and meet with Dasha, and we would have to do some creative thinking. But on the parliamentary procedure aspects of it, we can overcome that.
We'll get in touch with you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. You have been tremendous. You have certainly helped to create a dialogue around the table. I want to thank Sarah, our Open Caucus coordinator, who many of you received phone calls from, and who coordinated all of our witnesses and invited a number of people who are in our audience. I want to thank the senators for your participation. I know that life is pretty crazy this time of the year. And to the audience, not only for attending today, but also for your participation. Our next Open Caucus is on November 11th, and the topic of that day is child welfare in Canada. I look forward to seeing all of the senators and anybody else who wishes to participate, and I'll call...
November 11th?
No, 7th. 7th. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.